Okay, let's unpack this. We are staring down what is, maybe, the ultimate human fantasy. Living forever, healthy, eternally youthful.
Right.
It's the dream that's woven into, nearly every mythology, every single quest for the fountain of youth. But for thousands of years, there's been this philosophical challenge just lurking in the shadows.
Mm-hmm.
And it suggests that this ultimate fantasy is, in fact, the cruelest curse. The curse of eternal boredom.
It's the ultimate existential paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
The very thing we're programmed to fear death is
Yeah.
argued by some very serious philosophers to be the essential ingredient that makes life meaningful. And crucially, what keeps it interesting.
Interesting.
Without mortality, they argue, the entire motivational structure of human existence just collapses. It collapses into what the philosopher Bernard Williams famously called the Tedium of Immortality.
Right, the Micropolis case.
The Macropolis case, exactly.
Yeah.
It's from a play where a woman lives for 337 years, and by the end she finds life utterly, completely meaningless.
That sounds incredibly dark. But the thing is, it's becoming incredibly urgent. We're not just talking about, ancient Greek myths anymore. Not like Tithonus, who was granted immortality but not eternal youth and just withered away into a cicada.
No, this is real-world engineering.
It's real-world engineering. You look at the billionaires in Silicon Valley dumping hundreds of millions, maybe billions, into anti-aging research. Or the cryosleep tech being developed for deep space travel to Mars.
Or even the transhumanists seriously discussing how to upload consciousness.
Exactly. These aren't just hypotheticals anymore. They're actual projects that force us to ask a really uncomfortable question. Are we engineering an escape from death, or are we designing an inescapable psychological cage?
Precisely. And our mission today for you is to rigorously reconstruct this philosophical battle. We're going to take the source material and really unpack the core arguments, the ones that suggest immortality must lead to intolerable tedium.
And then the counter-argument.
And then we'll present the robust median view championed by thinkers like John Martin Fisher, who argue that, well, an eternal life would be no worse, and maybe even a lot better than the finite lives we lead now. We need to define the battlefield, unpack this identity crisis, and see if the desire for endless life can actually survive the critique of infinite boredom and, deep identity change.
So we have two giants fighting over the meaning of existence itself. Let's try to frame this. What is the single central philosophical debate we're analyzing here? Can we distill it into one sharp thesis?
I think we can. The central philosophical debate is whether the finiteness of human interests and psychological continuity inherently limits the desirability of an indefinitely long life.
Okay.
Making mortality a necessary prerequisite for meaning and value, OR. Whether life's repeatable, intrinsic, and unfinishable goods can sustain a meaningful existence indefinitely.
Wow. Okay, that is extremely dense. Let's slow down and break that sentence apart because it feels like it summarizes the entire struggle.
It does.
So you're saying the two fundamental limits that Williams identifies are A, we just run out of things to want the exhaustion of our interests.
Yes.
And B, we change so radically over, say, 1,000,000 years that we aren't the original us's anymore. The failure of psychological continuity. Is that right?
That is exactly right. The two challenges are the exhaustion of value and the persistence of self. And this entire debate really is a direct philosophical response to this powerful Western skepticism, which is just exemplified by Bernard Williams.
And his view is that death isn't the great evil to be defeated.
No, he sees it as a kind of preventative measure.
A preventative measure against what?
A blessing that prevents us from being, and this is his phrase, depleted of whatever makes life worth living. Williams essentially argues that the most valuable things in life, the things that give it shape and meaning, are valuable because we can only do them once, or because their value comes from their finite, limited nature.
The ticking clock.
The ticking clock. If you remove that limit, you remove the pressure that defines meaning and purpose. The stakes of our choices, our projects, our loves, they just vanish over infinite time.
The idea that death prevents boredom is it's just so counterintuitive. But I guess it starts to make sense when you think about the scale we're talking about. We aren't talking about living to be 1,000. We're talking about the next trillion years or more.
And that's exactly why the stakes are so modern and relevant. When we discuss life extension, we're funding these massive technological pursuits that absolutely demand philosophical grounding. Think about a long-duration space mission.
Right, to Mars.
If we achieve cryosleep, we are effectively giving a handful of individuals an indefinite life while they're in transit. They have to survive not just the physical journey, but the psychological one. And if we achieve medical immortality on Earth, Will the result be a desirable life? Or an inescapable, meaningless psychological cage? The answer has profound ethical, societal, and economic implications that we have to address now while the tech is being built.
Okay, so to follow these arguments, and especially the really sophisticated rebuttals to Williams's pessimism, we have to be super precise with our language. These philosophers use technical terms that are just crucial to their arguments, and they often mean something slightly different from how we use them casually. Let's lay out the conceptual rulebook for everyone listening.
Absolutely. We need, I'd say, 6 precise definitions to really understand the dynamics of both the exhaustion argument and the identity argument. Let's start with the central engine of motivation, what Williams calls categorical desires.
Categorical desires. What's a concrete example of one of those that Williams would say we'd eventually just finish?
Well, categorical desires are the deep, defining goals that give a person a reason to live and propel them into the future. They're the major life projects.
Like, I want to cure cancer.
Exactly. If you're driven by the categorical desire to, say, build a globally sustainable energy source, or to climb the highest peak on every continent, or even to raise your children to be good adults, these are goals that define your action now and give you a reason to exist tomorrow. They provide that intrinsic motivation.
And Williams's whole argument hinges on these being finite.
Yes, that they're exhaustible.
Mm,
Once you build the sustainable energy source, that specific desire is fulfilled. It's done. And its motivational power is gone forever.
that makes perfect sense. These are the life-defining projects.
Okay, what about the mechanism that connects me right now to the person who will be fulfilling those desires maybe 1,000 years in the future?
That is what the philosophers call prudential concern. This is the first personal, special concern one has for oneself. It's grounded in your sense of personhood and your similarity to your future self.
So, saving for retirement. A perfect example. When you forego a vacation today to save money for your retirement, that's prudential concern in action. The concern is partial. It's special because it's you who will benefit. The huge question in the immortality debate is whether this specific personal concern can possibly persist if your future self is radically discontinuous from who you are today.
Why should the 2025 version of me care about the well-being of the radically different, say, 3025 version of me?
Exactly. Why should you care about that person?
And the thing that determines whether that 3025 version is still me is psychological continuity. How do they define that?
Psychological continuity is the chain of overlapping memories, experiences, personality traits, and hopes that links your past, present, and future selves. Over a standard 80-year life, these links generally hold, right, even through major life changes.
Sure.
But critics of immortality worry that if you stretch this duration to millions or trillions of years, the links will fray entirely.
Yeah.
That leads to personal discontinuity. The you who started the journey just isn't the same you who continues it.
This brings us to the kinds of values that would fill that life. We have to talk about the things Williams claims are finite. The term is self-exhausting goods.
Right. And these are good things whose value contribution just diminishes rapidly, or things that can only be truly done once. The value of climbing Mount Everest for the first time is self-exhausting.
Mm-hmm.
Subsequent climbs are still valuable, sure, but the unique value of that inaugural accomplishment is non-repeatable. It's gone. Similarly, the value of discovering a new law of physics is self-exhausting. Once it's discovered, that specific intellectual conquest is finished.
So, okay, the counter-argument has to rely on goods that don't deplete. What's the term they use for that?
They rely on ampliative goods. This is a key concept from Fisher. These are goods, typically intrinsic in value, that do not have their value exhausted by repetition over an endless life. They are intrinsically valuable, and their value contribution doesn't saturate or deplete.
Are these basically the same thing as intrinsic goods?
They overlap a lot. Intrinsic goods, so things that are valuable in and of themselves, like appreciating beauty or the simple pleasure of friendship, are often cited as the primary examples of ampliative goods. Their value isn't tied to novelty or finishing a project.
It's about the experience itself.
It's about the constant, repeatable experience of the good itself. They enrich life every time you engage with them indefinitely.
Okay, finally, one last term, which is important for a critique we'll get to later. Final value.
Final value refers to what is valuable as an end in itself, which is contrasted with instrumental value, something that's valuable as a means to an end. Health, wealth, fame. These are examples of things people pursue for their own sake.
Right.
But the critical nuance here is that some philosophers argue that final values, even when you pursue them intrinsically, can still saturate. For instance, once you reach a certain level of health or wealth, Adding more doesn't necessarily enhance the value of your life, even if it adds to your total well-being.
So it makes you happier, but doesn't make your life better in some deeper sense.
Precisely. And that distinction helps us measure whether immortality is just more life or a genuinely better life.
Okay, so before we worry about running out of things to do, we have to tackle the structural integrity of the self. This is that huge challenge posed by the philosopher Derek Parfit. Will the person living for 1 trillion years be me? The person listening to this right now, Parfit's answer is probably not.
It's a fundamental objection. He argues that true immortality is kind of incoherent because personal identity, as we understand it, just fails to persist through significant, prolonged psychological transformation.
So if you change enough, you die anyway. A different kind of death.
In a sense, yes. Parfit suggests that if you change so profoundly, with your core memories fading and new desires completely replacing the old ones over cosmic timescales, the individual you ceases to exist.
How does that failure actually happen on a mechanism level? What's the model for it?
Parfit describes it using what we call the fraying rope metaphor. Think of all your psychological links, your memories, your personality traits, your hopes for the future, as individual strands forming a thick rope.
Okay.
In a standard 80-year lifespan, these strands are overlapping and robust enough to maintain a thick, strong sense of self-continuity. Your current memories connect you strongly to yourself of a decade ago, which is connected to yourself of 2 decades ago, and so on down the line. The rope holds,
But then you stretch it.
but then you stretch that duration to millions or billions of years.
Yeah.
You might have absolutely no personal memory of the person you were 10,000 years ago, let alone 10 million. The specific character traits and desires that define you today would be radically replaced, probably multiple times over that duration. The strands just don't connect anymore.
So the links that define the rope are constantly getting weaker as we move backward in time. This really illustrates the proximity problem. Our connection to our past self diminishes radically the further away in time that self is. I mean, my current self struggles to relate to or even remember the core drives of my 5-year-old self. If I live 1 trillion years, my God, the person who began the journey is effectively an entirely different psychological entity.
Exactly. The rope snaps. It leads to what philosophers call discontinuity. And the outcome isn't just a changed person, it's the end of the original person. It wouldn't be the same person at all, it would be more like different phases, or as the source material beautifully puts it, like a house with renters.
A house with renters, I like that.
The physical structure, the body, persists. But the identity, the renter, changes radically and repeatedly over time.
And this radical psychological transformation just fundamentally shatters our prudential concern. Why would I, the person I am today, feel any compulsion to care for or sacrifice for the well-being of some stranger who just happens to inhabit my physical shell 1 million years from now?
It's the philosophical equivalent of moving out of your own consciousness. Parfit reminds us that what we care about is the continuation of our thick self, our personality, our memories, our desires, not just the bare physical shell that persists. If those core traits are radically replaced, the person we care about, ourself, is essentially gone.
But wait a second, I have to push back here. Williams, the pessimist, argues that this radical change has to happen to prevent boredom. So if we must change radically to stay interested, doesn't that just prove Parfit's point? That the only desirable immortal life is one where I eventually cease to exist and someone else just takes over my body.
That is the crucial tension. There's the trap. Williams says you are caught between 2 equally undesirable outcomes: intolerable boredom as yourself or self-obliterating change into someone else. It's a lose-lose scenario.
So what's the way out?
Well, John Martin Fisher, he firmly rejects this maximalist worry. He's committed to the view that sufficient physical or bodily continuity, along with psychological continuity, even if it's stretched over trillions of years, is enough for personal identity to persist.
So he thinks the rope doesn't snap.
He thinks the rope doesn't snap. Fisher maintains that radical change happens even over a standard 80-year span. We become nearly unrecognizable to our childhood selves. If we don't commit a kind of identity suicide over 80 years, why must we assume that psychological continuity catastrophically fails at the 5,000-year mark, or the million-year mark? He suggests the changes are gradual and always overlapping, allowing the rope to remain continuous, even if it becomes extremely unimaginably long.
So Fisher is arguing that even if I can't remember being 2 years old, the continuity still exists because the 6-year-old me remembered the 2-year-old and the 12-year-old me remembered the 6-year-old. It creates a persistent chain no matter how long that chain stretches.
Precisely. As long as those overlapping links hold, identity, in his view, is maintained. and therefore the immortal would always feel a sufficient, persistent, prudential concern for the next iteration of their self. The renter never moves out, they just redecorate.
All right, now we get to the absolute core of William's pessimism, the boredom argument. This is the central challenge that makes mortality look like maybe a necessary good. Let's try to reconstruct William's argument formally, as our source material suggests we should, really focusing on this inevitable collapse of motivation.
This is where that logical rigor is essential. William's core argument can be formally laid out like this.
Okay.
P1. A life worth living must be propelled by categorical desires. So those big goals and projects that give you a reason to live.
Got it.
P2. In an immortal life, all finite categorical desires will eventually be fulfilled, repeated, or just depleted of their value. They are, in a word, self-exhausting.
Right.
Therefore, an immortal life will inevitably lack the motivation needed to make it worth living, which leads to intolerable boredom or tedium.
The conclusion sounds just miserable. If you've achieved every possible goal that has ever mattered to you, you're just left drifting in an infinite void.
That's the picture he paints.
But the entire defense of immortality seems to rest on destroying P2. The critics have to argue that the premise that all valuable things are exhaustible is just false.
Exactly. Fisher and other critics directly challenge the scope of P2. They say it's far too strong. They point to three major categories of goods that provide value that defies exhaustion. And if these goods exist and are plentiful, well, then the supply of motivational fuel is indefinite.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, and maybe the simplest, is repeatable pleasures. Not all good things diminish with repetition. William's pessimism often seems to assume a kind of saturation of sensory experience, but this ignores basic necessities and simple intrinsic joys.
Like what?
Take the example cited. Drinking a cool glass of water when you are thirsty, listening to a beautiful piece of music, or enjoying a good meal. The value they bring doesn't just go to neutral because you've experienced them before. The pleasure is reset and renewed by the condition like being thirsty, or by the intrinsic quality of the activity itself.
So the key there is the difference between doing something to achieve a goal, which is exhaustible, and doing something simply because the activity itself is enjoyable and inherently valuable.
That leads directly to the second point. Ampliative or intrinsic goods. These are goods whose value contribution doesn't saturate or deplete even with endless repetition. If you watch a great movie for the 10th time, or you appreciate a great work of art like a Rembrandt painting, you can still find the experience enhances your life.
You're not discovering something new, but...
Right, you might not be learning a new fact, but your capacity for appreciation and enjoyment can remain incredibly high. The key is that these things enhance life, not through completion, but through continuous engagement.
And the third, and this one feels like the most powerful objection, involves what you called unfinishable projects. These are goals that defy exhaustion because their aim is, what, a moving target.
A moving target, exactly. The examples usually cited are the open-ended pursuits of mathematics and philosophy, or the pursuit of truth and justice, or just artistic creativity. The source we're looking at notes that the aim of these activities cannot be fixed prior to the activity itself, and is gradually defined in the course of its pursuit. Interest in these kinds of activities could keep a person engaged for an indefinitely long time.
Wait, let's dig deep into that distinction for a second. Why are math and philosophy considered unfinishable, but something like physics or chemistry might be finishable? Why is pure thought different from empirical science in this context?
This is a really profound distinction, and it's based on the nature of the domain. In some kind of idyllic semi-paradise setting with indefinite time and resources, you could imagine an immortal civilization eventually solving the fundamental problems of the material world.
They'd figure everything out.
They might. They might discover every particle, every fundamental force, and every last law of physics and chemistry. Those fields, because they're bound by the empirical limits of our universe, might conceptually become finished.
But pure thought isn't bound by that.
But the pursuit of pure abstract thought, like in mathematics, is potentially infinite. Think about the implications of Gödel's incompleteness theorems.
Okay, remind us.
Well, very roughly, they suggest that in any formal mathematical system that's complex enough to include basic arithmetic, there will always be true statements that cannot be proven within that system. This philosophical insight essentially guarantees an endless frontier of new theorems to discover, new logical systems to explore, new proofs to find. It never ends.
And philosophy is the same.
In a way, The pursuit of truth and justice is constantly evolving. It depends on new circumstances, new technologies, the progress of human understanding. It's boundless.
So the material world has limits, but the world of pure logic and abstraction does not. That feels like a definitive defense against the exhaustion of all projects.
It's a very strong one.
Now, we have to circle back to boredom itself. The sources distinguish between different kinds because Williams isn't just worried about, a dull Tuesday afternoon, is he?
Absolutely not. It's a critical distinction.
Yeah.
We have to separate situational boredom from chronic or habitual boredom, which is often called ennui.
Situational boredom is waiting in line at the DMV.
Exactly. It's external. It comes from a lack of immediate external stimulation, and it's easily solved by just changing activities. But chronic boredom, or ennui, is a much deeper internal state. It reflects a fundamental lack of categorical desires, a lack of meaning. It's often linked to depression and existential despair.
And Williams fears that infinite life inevitably leads to the chronic internal kind. The well of motivation just runs dry no matter what external novelties are available.
Precisely. Williams argues that the internal mechanism for caring about anything, the categorical desire, is fundamentally depleted over infinite time. The external world can offer limitless activities, but if the immortal no longer has the internal motivation to pursue anything, then tedium is absolutely inescapable.
This philosophical concept of depletion, it's perfectly illustrated in a popular culture analogy that the source material brings up. The final arc of the show, The Good Place.
Oh, that show is a perfect modern parable of the boredom argument. It's brilliant. The characters, they've achieved every possible pleasure, they've experienced every culture, solved every problem, and achieved total spiritual enlightenment. They're at the metaphorical finish line of eternity.
They're good, they're happy, they're perfect.
And yet, the existential weight of unending time just presses in on them. They become listless.
So they sought annihilation. They basically create a portal that lets them just cease to exist. It's effectively a suicide machine.
It is. And it demonstrates that even a perfect eternal afterlife suffers from the depletion of purpose. The ultimate satisfaction of all desire removes the engine of motivation, the need to strive for anything. The solution they came up with wasn't finding a new activity. It was the ultimate safety valve, the ability to choose non-existence when life no longer felt meaningful.
We've spent a lot of time fighting the claim that immortality is bad.
Let's pivot now to the really counterintuitive claim. What if death isn't just an obstacle to avoid, but a necessary driver of value? This is where it gets truly provocative, right? This moves the debate beyond just avoiding boredom and starts to argue that mortality is a positive structural contributor to a meaningful life, that it provides both urgency and an enhanced value to our achievements.
Okay, let's start with urgency.
Consider the urgency principle, which is championed by thinkers like Viktor Frankl. Death, as an absolute finish to our future and boundary to our possibilities, creates an imperative to use our lifetimes to the utmost. If we were immortal, we could legitimately postpone every single action forever. We could say, I'll learn Spanish in 100,000 years and I'll get around to writing that novel in a million. There would be absolutely no internal pressure to start, only an infinite amount of time to procrastinate.
The deadline motivates the work. Without the deadline, the work might never start, or at least the motivation to seize the day just completely vanishes.
Exactly, but we need a critical distinction here that the sources highlight. Mortality awareness acts as an extrinsic motivation. It's a looming deadline that prods us into action. However, leading a truly meaningful life requires intrinsic motivation.
What's the difference in this context?
Intrinsic motivation is being driven to do a specific activity for its own sake, like the pursuit of scientific truth because you're curious, or a passion for artistic creativity because you love the act of creating.
So death can make us start pursuing something, but it doesn't tell us what to pursue. It just applies pressure.
Exactly. Mortality awareness is nonspecific. It only prods us to make the most of life before it's too late. The source highlights the case of Randy Pausch, the computer science professor who, after a terminal cancer diagnosis, gave the last lecture.
I remember that. It was huge.
It was, and his imminent mortality provided this tremendous extrinsic motivation to communicate life lessons to his children and to a much larger community. It demonstrates how finitude can enhance meaning. The poignancy of that lecture is tied directly to the finitude of the speaker.
So beyond urgency, how does death enhance the actual value of a specific human achievement or action?
Through what we can call the challenge and sacrifice principle. First, death enhances the value of achievements that transcend finitude. When a mortal being, like Plato writes, works that influence human thought for 2,000 years, even though he no longer exists. He has overcome the temporal limit to connect with what we called final value.
Mm.
The fact that he achieved this despite his own finitude, his own brief existence, arguably makes his life more meaningful than if he had simply lived on forever to watch his own impact unfold.
And the second part is sacrifice.
Second, death increases the magnitude of sacrifice and heroism. Mortal beings risk their one finite life to save others. Firefighters, police officers, doctors fighting epidemics. The sacrifice is more heroic and more meaningful precisely because they risk the one and only lifetime they have.
Right. If everyone were immortal and could just, reboot in a new body, the risk of loss, while still a threat to well-being, wouldn't carry the same weight of ultimate final loss.
The finality of death is what magnifies the moral weight of their actions.
This brings us to a highly sophisticated argument from a philosopher named Douglas MacLean, which distinguishes between merely increasing our overall well-being and truly adding value to a life. Unpack this for us in detail because it's a tricky concept.
It is. MacLean argues that living longer may increase your total well-being by satisfying what he calls conditional desires, but it does not necessarily add value to a life that's already been lived fully. He suggests we need to separate what makes us feel good from what gives a life its ultimate value structure.
Okay, use the ice cream and beach trick analogy from the source to illustrate the separation for us.
Okay. Let's say you have lived a full, meaningful life. You've raised a family, you've contributed to science, you've achieved all your categorical desires. Now, at the end of that life, you have a conditional desire for one more ice cream cone or one more trip to the beach.
Sure, who wouldn't?
Right. Satisfying that desire will certainly increase your well-being, your subjective happiness in the moment. But MacLean argues that this specific interest is not the kind of interest that adds value to your life, even in the slightest degree.
So if you missed the beach trip, your life wouldn't be worse.
Exactly. Nor would one extra trip make your already full life more valuable. The well-being meter goes up, but the value metric remains neutral.
So the value of a life isn't just an aggregate of good experiences piled on top of each other.
No, MacLean really pushes against that idea of simple aggregate value.
Yeah.
He argues that final value saturates. He uses this accomplishment saturation argument, comparing it to Rembrandt's genius.
How does that work?
If we discover one new, genuine Rembrandt painting today, it increases the quantity of his known work, his oeuvre. But it doesn't really change our assessment of his artistic value or his genius.
Yeah.
That was already established by his core contributions.
I see.
In the same way, he argues, living longer after a full life has been lived and major contributions have been made doesn't necessarily increase its value. The quality and depth of the contribution are what matter, not the duration of the contributor.
I have to challenge this conclusion, though. Isn't that deeply limiting? It sounds like MacLean is saying that after, say, age 70, nothing you do can significantly increase the value of your life, only the quantity of pleasant experiences. Why can't a brand new scientific discovery made at age 200 add value?
Oh, it could, but MacLean's point is more subtle. He's focusing on the interest in longevity itself. If you are pursuing a new categorical desire, say, solving a new mathematical mystery at age 200, then that pursuit absolutely adds value. But the desire to simply live longer, just for the sake of it, is a conditional desire based on enjoying what already exists. If the life is already full, satisfying the conditional interest in longevity is neutral to life's overall value.
So you're not worse off dying.
And you're not better off living longer, in terms of final value. This suggests that for a meaningful life, maximizing the quality of the time you have now is far more important than just extending the quantity of it indefinitely.
This has been a fascinating journey through the limits of human motivation. So let's assume for a minute that the anti-immortality pessimists are wrong. Let's say we can survive the identity crisis, and we can find infinite repeatable pleasures. If we do achieve radical life extension, how might we practically solve the residual risk of boredom? What are the technological and psychological safety valves?
Okay, we can look at three major categories here: engineered quiescence, cognitive modulation, and psychological reframing.
Let's start with the tech.
Starting with technological interventions, one solution proposed to counteract the sheer, crushing length of existence is engineered inactivity or prolonged sleep. Cryosleep is currently being researched by NASA and companies like SpaceWorks.
Right, for the Mars missions.
Exactly, for long space missions. The goal is to induce a kind of deep sleep for periods of 6 to 9 months at a time to reduce biological needs and, crucially, psychological strain.
But how does that solve the existential problem of boredom? It feels like it just kicks the can down the road.
Well, NASA hypothesizes that this periodic hibernation would counteract psychological distress, anxiety, claustrophobia, and boredom. It would allow the astronauts, or in our case, the immortals, to wake up feeling a renewed sense of novelty.
A psychological reset.
It's a psychological reset, exactly. It enables the individual to shed the monotony of the previous era and regain interest in activities after a period of quiescence. It's a literal, engineered way to break up the continuity of endless existence. It's like hitting the skip button on a really long, difficult chapter of a book. An even more direct approach is suggested by the transhumanist community: cognitive modulation. From this perspective, boredom is viewed as just a solvable problem,
Because it's just brain chemistry.
because all our emotions, including ennui, are functions of evolved chemical and neurological pathways. Future technology could allow us to literally reprogram our biology at will.
So we could just tweak our internal settings to stay curious.
Exactly. We could modulate emotional states or tweak chemical pathways to ensure that contentment, curiosity, and engagement remain maximally functional. If the subjective experience of tedium can just be removed or altered at will, boredom simply ceases to be a meaningful problem for the immortal individual, no matter what's happening externally.
But what if we don't want to chemically alter our consciousness? Are there psychological or spiritual pathways that could address boredom more naturally?
Yes, the sources introduce the argument of the meditation and the Buddha path. This perspective suggests that expert meditators are largely immune to boredom. They're able to find profound enjoyment at any time, even in highly repetitive or static environments.
So boredom is a state of mind.
It suggests that boredom is fundamentally a state of mind, a reaction to a lack of stimulation, rather than a necessary consequence of external reality. By reframing existence as an intrinsic good, this path advocates changing one's reaction to boredom so it no longer causes suffering. And another psychological approach is the create wave in VR. The idea here is that if the physical universe ever runs out of external novelty, an immortal civilization would just pivot. They'd start creating and exploring near one-to-one real immersion of full-dive virtual reality worlds.
An infinite number of new worlds to explore.
An infinite number. With billions of creative, self-aware immortals, you would have an endless array of self-generated realities, uniquely shaped by expression and imagination. This provides an inexhaustible, self-renewing source of novelty that just completely sidesteps the exhaustion argument.
Finally, we come back to the critical distinction that seems to remove all the existential pressure entirely: the power of choice. This feels like the ultimate philosophical safety valve.
This is critical to defeating Williams's curse. We absolutely have to differentiate between the aspiration to choose to live forever, if you're still healthy and able, and being forced to live forever.
Mandatory immortality.
Yes. Well, as one source notes, mandatory immortality is definitely bad. Williams' argument works perfectly against that. It would be a prison.
But if you can leave,
But if you have the ability to voluntarily choose a painless final end, the entire existential threat of intolerable tedium vanishes. If you find yourself truly depleted of meaning, you step through the annihilation portal, and the philosophical objection to immortality just dissolves because the curse is no longer inescapable. The aspiration for longevity is desirable precisely because the power to end it rests with the immortal individual.
so to wrap up,
We started by questioning whether immortality is even worth having. And I think this whole debate demonstrates that the primary obstacle to desiring eternal life isn't physiological anymore. We're increasingly treating aging as a collection of solvable diseases. The real problem is psychological and existential.
it's the exhaustion of identity, desire, and value.
Exactly.
We've seen that the pessimistic view, articulated so well by Williams, relies on this idea that our deep categorical desires are finite and they will inevitably run dry.
But the critics offer these powerful counterarguments. The existence of repeatable pleasures, the inexhaustible nature of ampliative goods like art, the boundless open-ended activities of math and philosophy.
And the technological fixes like cryosleep or cognitive modulation, and maybe most crucially, the option to voluntarily end your life.
Right. The consensus that seems to come from these sources suggests that immortality, if it becomes achievable, is desirable, but only if the individual retains the ultimate power of choice. If you can voluntarily end your life when the tedium truly becomes intolerable, then the mandate to suffer through an endless, meaningless existence is broken.
But let's end with a final, provocative thought that circles all the way back to the core role mortality plays in giving life value. The philosopher Galen Strawson offers a metaphysical claim that just challenges all of our assumptions, he says. Death at any age deprives us of nothing.
This is a really challenging claim, and it's often met with a lot of emotional resistance, especially when we think about the grief associated with premature loss. But the reasoning is purely logical.
Explain it.
He says, it is confused to think that we can lose or be deprived of a future life, because we cannot claim any future as ours that we do not live to experience. When we die, we lose the possibility of having those future experiences, but we cannot lose the experiences themselves because they never existed in the first place. Therefore, the moment of death does not deprive the person who dies of anything that was theirs.
So if we accept that, and it's a big if that death only deprives us of possibilities, then maybe our whole focus should shift entirely, away from duration and towards the quality and value we create in the time we have. If longevity, as McLean argues, merely increases our overall well-being, but doesn't really add value to an already meaningful life, then this whole obsession with more time might be philosophically misplaced.
And that raises the most important question for you to mull over or explore on your own. If death, metaphysically speaking, deprives us of nothing, does longevity in itself add anything substantial to the final, completed value of a meaningful life? Think about that.